On va maintenant écouter les deux derniers intervenants de la matinée. Et on va commencer par Samba Faye qui va nous parler de Jamaica Kincaid et de Fatou Diome et une lecture transatlantique des questions liées au genre dans un contexte postcolonial. So we start this part of the session with Samba Faye from the research center IMAGER-LISAA, and his presentation is dedicated to Jamaica Kincaid and Fatou Diome, and it's entitled Transatlantic Gender Issues in a Postcolonial Era.
Merci. Bonjour. Donc, ma communication se propose de réfléchir sur la circulation des théories de genre dans trois grands espaces, c'est-à-dire l'Europe, l'Afrique et l'Amérique. Le travail que je présente aujourd'hui est un extrait de ma thèse. Donc, je vais présenter en anglais en fait. This presentation is extracted from a thesis I'm preparing entitled Racial and Gendered Identities in Immigrant Literature, a comparative study of Jamaica Kincaid and Fatou Diome. Jamaica Kincaid and Fatou Diome are female writers, originating from former colonial areas, respectively Antigua and Senegal. Their production generally problematized the immigration of the black female subject caught between a patriarchal motherland and a racist host country. This feeling of unbelonging, represented as being torn between different cultural spaces, social groups, or geographic areas, constitutes the foundation of their narrative construction. But in this presentation, I will mainly focus on the treatment of gender in two of these writers' novels, namely Kincaid's Lucy, published in 1999, and Diome's Le Ventre de l'Atlantique, published in 2003 and translated into English as The Belly of the Atlantic. Jamaica Kincaid's Lucy tells in a very simple and to a certain extent crude language, the journey of an adolescent girl who leaves her native Antigua for the United States. At her arrival in the middle of January, she discovers a total new way of life, entirely different from her Antiguan routine, but also very different from her great positive expectations of America as the land of freedom. At the age of 19, Lucy Josephine Potter, whose first name is a diminutive of Lucifer, is confronted to the harsh reality of immigration. She works as an au pair for Maria and Louis, a white couple. Closely resembling Kincaid's own experience, Lucy brings to light little-known aspects of immigration and highlights the double oppression of which black women are victims of. This theme of double oppression is also central in Fatou Diome's novel, The Belly of the Atlantic. Originally published in French in 2003, its metaphoric title, The Belly of the Atlantic, refers to the crossing of the Atlantic Ocean that separates Africa from Europe. The main theme of the novel is then immigration. Sally, the heroine, lives in France but originates from the Senegalese island of New York, where her brother Madike still lives. Madike expects his sister to give him a hand to migrate to France, which he views as a promised land, where foreign footballers become overnight stars. Sally faces the problem of explaining to her brother the hidden and harsh realities of the immigrant experience and the hardships that she undergoes. These two novels can be said to deal with what Jean-Paul Rocky and Monica Michelin, in their work Black Intersectionalities, a critique for the 21st century, called, after Kimberly Crenshaw, Intersecting Identities, in the sense that these works depict the interconnections between racial and sexual oppression. However, this today project presentation while disclosing the articulation of race and gender. In these fictions, will put the emphasis on the circulation of gender theories between four geographical cultural areas, namely Africa, Europe, Antigua, and the United States. Taking the example of gender issues, this paper intends to show how an idea emerges from one place at a precise moment and a particular context to disseminate into other social cultural milieu. In Lucy and the Belly of the Atlantic, gender, mainly treated from a feminist approach, is represented as a division of social tasks, repartition of domestic roles between males and females. Thus, it appears under its more traditional form inscribed in a binary logic and can be referred to as synonym of social sex. Though Kincaid and Diome in their other literary productions employ themselves to show the complexity of gender identities while introducing the theme of homosexuality, in these two particular novels, they resort to the heterosexist patriarchal model to better challenge it and hence better deconstruct male chauvinism. However, in the fictions of these authors, how do feminist ideas circulate and how are they reproduced according to spaces? In other words, what makes this cultural flux possible? Through which canals do gender theories travel from the area of emission to the area of reception? In the novels of Diome and Kincaid, analyzed as a literary representation of colonialism and its problematic legacy, what are the mechanisms and institutions used to facilitate such a transfer from the colonial power to the colonized territories and vice versa? In the perspective of female immigrant writings, the idea of transfer is well rendered by the mobility of characters exporting and importing theories between the different spaces they visit. Actually, if one considers immigrant writings as a full-fledged literary trend, one should recognize that it is characterized by a dense circulation of characters, writers, and then knowledge. Generally, in this trend, theories travel from space to space via three main canals. First, one can list school. Second, the speech of those who are returning home. And third, the correspondences, letters, telephone, television, and technologies. These tools are used by Kincaid and Diome to unveil how the post-colonial heroine discovers differences in the treatment of some socio-political issues as the one of gender. The protagonist, through these canals, discovers in reality how the sexual oppression that she is victim of has been dealt with in some other cultures. That is to say, how the European American idea of feminism brought in by colonial institutions is at the same time very similar and very different from the preoccupation and expectations of the local existing feminist traditions. Is it possible for the post-colonial subject to create a hybrid feminism? Or do these Western feminist ideas simply alienate her while altering the perception of her social reality? In this first part, despite the plurality of the transmitting canals, I will just focus on one of them, the colonial school. My aim is then to underline the role of the school, taken here as a colonial institution, how it participates in the transferring process as a potential source of alienation. In fact, it is accepted that one of the most relevant and powerful tools used by the colonizer to disseminate his ideology is without any doubt school. Thanks to its capacity to erase and implement new ideas, the Western school has played and still plays an important role in the alienation of many former colonized subjects, often perceived as a contact zone, where the autochthon experiences new practices, new beliefs, and behaviors. European colonial school is by excellence the right place of discovery, but also of depersonalization. This is what Sally, the heroine of The Belly of the Atlantic, points out when remembering her school teacher, Monsieur Descartes. I quote, "I owe him Descartes, I owe him Montesquieu, I owe him Victor Hugo, I owe him Molière, I owe him Marx, I owe him Dostoevsky, I owe him Hemingway, I owe him Leopold Sédar Senghor, I owe him MSSR, I owe him Simone de Beauvoir, Marguerite Yourcenar, Maria Maba, and the rest. End of the quotation. In this passage, Sally recognizes through the character of Monsieur Detard, actually the embodiment of the European culture, what she has inherited from the Western school. From a literal perspective, one might be tempted to reduce this statement to a tribute to her primary school teacher. But a deeper analysis reveals that Sally, through the figure of the antonomasia, reveals that behind Detard's character one should see Western school. This antonomastic dimension of Detard's character epitomizing Western knowledge is confirmed by the primary school teacher introduction to the reader. The homodiegetic narrator remarks that he is distinguishable from the other inhabitants of the land by his silhouette, his ways, his urban manners, his European clothes, his academic French. But beyond this idea of that perfectly rendered by the anaphoric repetition of I.O. between a student and her teacher, what is quite interesting in this relation is the content of such a debt. What has been transmitted? The protagonist mentions that she is thankful to her teacher who familiarized her with the theories of some great thinkers exemplified by Descartes, Montesquieu, Hugo, and some black intellectuals embodied in this context by two key figures of the negritude movement, Leopold Sédar Senghor and MSSR. But what will not escape to the reader in this statement is, of course, the alignment of feminist thinkers at the end of the quotation. Apparently respecting a hierarchical order in the listing of the feminist writers, Sally implicitly shows to the reader the different sequences of the feminist movement's evolution. In putting Simone de Beauvoir, a monument of French feminism, on the top of her list, Sally admits that France has played a leading role in the feminist movement. Moreover, Beauvoir's position in the list becomes more interesting in the sense that it highlights the close relationship which exists between the author and the narrator. Sally, whose story also echoes a lot Diome's own experience, joins the author's admiration for Beauvoir. In fact, in Diome's dedicate, one can see Simone de Beauvoir associated with her mother. This dedication reveals that both the author and the narrator plead allegiance to Jean-Paul Sartre's partner. Fatou Diome claims also a maternal influence originating from her African socialization in New York. The allusion to the maternal figure as a sister exposes the complicity which exists between the two women as suggested in a larger perspective. Diome's approbation of Bell Hooks' idea of sorority. If Diome creolizes feminist ideas born in the West embodied by Beauvoir with some African values inherited from her mother, in the novel Sally completes her reading of gender issues with the work of the Senegalese novelist Maria Maba, author of So Long a Letter. In her epistolary novel, Ba uses the correspondences between Ramatoulaye and her friend Aïssatou, exiled in the United States, as a plea to show the difficulty of combining the Western education received at the colonial school with the cultural reality of her social media. To a certain extent, Diome's heroine is undergoing the same experience. She notices that her knowledge of the European culture has created a gap, illustrated by the metaphoric image of the world between her and the other female subjects of her native island. In this regard, she affirms, the women didn't often invite me into their world, nor did I participate much in their activities. My presence made them uncomfortable. They had long considered me as a lazy bones who couldn't do anything with her 10 fingers other than turn the pages of a book, a self-centered person. My pen went on tracing the path I had taken to leave them. Every notebook I filled, every book I read, every dictionary I consulted was one more break in the wall dividing us. End of the quotation. School has effectively created a distance between the protagonist and her female neighbors. All possibilities of dialogue between them are very nearly unimaginable. Sally has become the other, the westernized Miss High and Mighty who criticizes traditional values to talk as her brother Madike. This ambiguous role played by school has been dealt with in Kincaid's Lucy, with almost the same intention, namely to reveal at the same time the Western school's capacity to alienate the postcolonial subject, but also to enrich and enlarge her approach of gender issues. In fact, both Diome and Kincaid's heroine underlines the school's role in the creolization of feminist idea. However, my intention is, in the second part, to show how this author, after recognizing the influences of the Western feminist tradition, deconstruct them and claim the existence of a tradition before the arrival of the colonizer. In this regard, I will first focus on the criticism of Western female subject, and second, study the figure of the grandmother as a feminist model. If the Western female subject considers very often herself as liberated from male domination, Jamaica Kincaid and Diome responds that patriarchy still prevails in the West. In other words, the author of My Brother maintains that sexism has found new ways to express itself and has even been unconsciously normalized. This position is well illustrated by the marital relations between Maria and Lewis, the bourgeois couple which Lucy works for. Lewis is a brilliant lawyer and very busy with his work, whereas Maria is idle. This is almost the same conclusion that Lin Yifang draws from her analysis of his couple in her article, Subject of Desire, a Portrait of White Female in Jamaica Kincaid Diome. Yifang affirms that Maria illustrates the ambivalent position of the white women as being the same time the oppressor and the oppressed. Her situation helps to have a better comprehension of female status and the society that has made her so. Maria's portrayal as an idle woman is illustrative of Lucy's conception of the white female subject. To reinforce her argument, the narrator multiplies the anecdotes showing Maria's incapacity to exist by herself. From the divorce episode to the failed sex relation with the important old man, Maria keeps on blaming herself for not being able to satisfy male characters. Despite all of this, Maria still thinks that she should help Lucy to liberate herself from male chauvinism. She tries to introduce her to some Western feminist writers, as the narrator mentions it. I quote, "Maria wanted to rescue me. She spoke of women in society, women in history, women in culture, women everywhere. Maria has completely misinterpreted my situation. My life could not really be explained by this trick book that made my hands hurt as I tried to keep it open. My life was at once more simple and more complicated than that." End of the quotation. In this extract, Lucy summarizes very well the situation of the black female subject who has real problem to adjust with Western feminist ideas. Fatou Diome calls for a rediscovery of the African traditions embodied by the figure of the grandmother. Sally has a particular relationship with her maternal grandmother, who she ends up considering as her real mother. The narrator's grandmother, also referred to as Madame Sarr, is in charge of the protagonist's education. She encourages Sally on her schooling despite her total ignorance of the realities and the finality of such an enterprise. In a context where school was almost exclusively reserved for boys, she accepted to send her granddaughter to watch over her evening revision by the light of the hurricane lamp. The reader, as the plot goes by, discovers gradually a strong and courageous lady who dares to stand up against the traditional patriarchal norm. Through the figure of her grandmother, Sally openly counter-attacks while deconstructing the widespread cliché of the black female subject as submissive character who accepts passively her fate, and at the same time responds to the defenders of the theory according to which feminist ideas were exclusively inherited from the Western world. From her perspective, there were feminist manifestations before the arrival of the colonial school, which has the merit of conceptualizing feminism and gave it later a more institutional visibility. To conclude, Can one talk in the context of postcolonial studies about a transfer of gender theories? Of course, yes, but here transfer should not be understood as the hegemonic transplantation of values from a particular social group to another, but rather be considered as a translation process, to talk as the Senegalese philosopher Souleymane Bachir Diagne. For Diagne, translation is simply the capacity to hear in another language the words that another myself is delivering in a different dialect. In the framework of Kincaid and Diome's production, Diagne's term has effectively the merit of being suitable in the sense that it contests the verticality of the circulation and the implicit unidirectional dimension. More than a linguistic process, his term has also challenges what he calls un universel de surplomb, which imposes its cultural logics to the others, as it is the case with some Western feminists who universalize their conception and aim at imposing it everywhere, as there can only be one single way of being a feminist. To this universel de surplomb, he suggests to replace it with an universel lateral, which is much more inclusive. More clearly, his works echoes a lot the Glissanian idea of creolization, or a cross-cultural encounter, a cross-pollination of cultures, of which Jamaica Kincaid and Fatou Diome's creolization of gender issues is exemplary of. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions. Yep.
I have just a few comments and just one question. With regards to your notion of colonial school, I wonder if you have explored other women writers, diasporic women writers, who discuss the role of colonial school. One of the most famous would be Olive Senior, the Jamaican one, with maybe you know her, with her poem Colonial Girls' School. I don't know if you have studied this one. It could be interesting, I think, in the context of your study, especially in this section when she discusses the fact that there was nothing at all about them at school. So it would be interesting. Another thing that you could also explore, and I wonder if you do in your work, when you discuss the remittances, I mean, what you call transfer, transferring money and diasporic transfers. I wonder if you explore the notion of diasporic remittances, which is theorized by a young American researcher, scholar of the name of Kezia Page. Sorry, Kezia Page. And yes, she has published a book, I think 2 years ago, on diasporic remittances, and I wondered if you do explore the notion of remittance in your work. And my last question is about Jamaica Kincaid. I'm not familiar at all with the other author, but I wondered if there is a connection between them in terms of, Kincaid's anger towards her country of origin, towards Antigua, the anger that you see in a work, A Small Place. I wondered if there is any connection in terms of this angry attitude that she has. Thanks.
Yes.
Oui, bonjour. Merci pour l'exposé. Je voudrais juste vous poser 2 questions. En fait, je voudrais revenir un peu sur le rôle de l'école dans la constitution de nos différents personnages et d'autre part la problématique de la traduction que vous avez évoquée vers la fin de votre exposé, en l'occurrence la traduction qui est vue par Souleymane Bachir Diagne. Merci.
So, to answer to your question about the colonial school, I haven't heard of that poem yet. I haven't heard, but I will double check. I will see what I can do with it and how to put it in my work. About the diaspora remittances, I haven't also heard about it, but that would be quite interesting to see what has been said about it and to put it in perspective with my work. Kincaid's anger. Yes, there is a lot of anger in Kincaid's writing, and there is, if we talk about her anger, we can put it in relation with the other author also. She is, at a certain point, when you read Fatou Diome, you think that she is like against the Senegalese society. It's almost the same thing. I mean, it's the same perspective, being against the mother, which metaphorically refers to the homeland. It's almost the same thing. There is anger in both writings, in both works, I think. There is a lot of anger. Ok, pour revenir à l'école, le rôle de l'école. En fait, le rôle de l'école est très, très compliqué dans ces écritures, en fait. Parce que l'école joue deux rôles, en plus. Joue un rôle double. On va prendre une figure mythologique, en fait. La figure dionysienne, en fait. Deux visages. L'école a deux visages. Donc, dans un certain sens, il agit tel le pharmacon platonicien, en fait. Si il peut être considéré comme un poison, il peut être aussi, l'établissement scolaire, je veux dire, peut être perçu comme un poison, peut être aussi perçu comme un remède. Pourquoi peut être perçu comme un poison? Parce que il aide, ou bien il fait naître chez le sujet féminin une prise de conscience. Il lui apporte une certaine richesse. De la même manière aussi, l'école devient un poison quand elle déracine le sujet féminin, en fait. Parce que si on s'en tient au projet dans The Invention of Africa de Valentin Yves Modembo, he says colonization operates, il dit que la colonisation agit en trois dimensions, en fait. Il y a une dimension qui cherche à dominer l'espace physique, une dimension qu'il appelle la reformulation des esprits, et une dimension selon laquelle la colonisation tendrait à mettre les économies des pays colonisés dans une perspective occidentale. Donc, dans la reformulation de l'esprit des colonisés, il rejoint plus ou moins l'écrivain kenyan Ngugi wa Thiong'o qui parlait de decolonizing the minds. Donc l'école a une capacité, peut formater et peut transformer, aliéner et faire changer de point de vue totalement le sujet féminin. Créer un gap, comme l'a bien montré Fatou Diome avec le personnage de Sally. Sally devient exactement l'autre, celle qui n'arrive plus à s'intégrer dans sa société. Et la seule solution qui reste, c'est de s'expatrier, c'est de partir ailleurs. Et même si elle part ailleurs aussi, il y a toujours des problèmes qui vont se poser. Donc, plus ou moins, l'école a fait que le sujet féminin s'est perdu, en fait.
Ce qui fait que, finalement, dans ce contexte postcolonial, la circulation d'idées, elle pose aussi la question, finalement, on en revient au début de la session, du pouvoir, de la façon dont le pouvoir détermine, façonne l'espace, permet que l'espace soit transformé, pose aussi du coup la question de la circulation entre l'espace de la production scientifique, artistique, littéraire et l'espace mondain pour une transformation sociale qu'on a pu évoquer tout à l'heure avec le séminaire transdisciplinaire sur la question des prisons. Et c'est aussi une question qu'on avait retrouvée dans votre présentation. Donc finalement, il y a aussi une lecture épistémique. On ne peut pas détacher en fait la question épistémologique de la question politique, à la fois pour la question du transfert, mais aussi du coup la question de la structure, de l'espace où ce transfert a lieu, où les espaces qui sont considérés, les rapports de force, la question politique, la verticalité que vous aviez pu évoquer dans votre propre communication au début de la session. Et je crois que ça prendra aussi une forme encore plus aiguë cet après-midi avec la notion de queerization. Et